I was principal scientist at Abiomed from 1988 to 1991. This was an interesting time. There was a collaboration between Senator Kennedy, I believe, and one of the Republican senators from the Southwest, each of whom had a potential beneficiary company in their district, to put together a program with the National Institutes of Health to develop an artificial heart. Uh, and that was just about the time I was looking for a job. So I wound up with that job at Abiomed, which is up on the North Shore. Uh, by the way, we refer to the total artificial heart by its initials, TAH, and often just called it the TA. Later, when the device was actually being put into patients, it was renamed the AbioCor. And this is all public domain information. Now, let's see. Why am I? Okay. So it turns out, in rough numbers, that about 100,000 Americans could benefit from an artificial heart each year. They're basically dying because their heart is failing. And there are essentially 20,000 heart transplants available every year. So there's a significant market for people who could make use of this device. The first artificial heart that was used by human beings was the Jarvik. Robert Jarvik developed this back in the 1960s, and it was powered by compressed air. So basically, there was a console that had to sit next to the patient's bed, and the patient was pretty much tethered to that. The number of patients were implanted with this device over the years, the most famous early one being Barney Clark, you may have read about. And like Barney Clark, most long-term patients suffered strokes due to blood clots forming in the heart and transferring to the brain. And so the Jarvik was used extensively for short-term heart replacement while waiting for a transplant. But there was essentially no device available that was acceptable for long-term heart replacement. Uh, it turns out that blood is an interesting medium. It will clot if it sees either too much or too little shear or an incompatible surface chemistry. And so there are a number of things that can create clots. So, yeah, blood has a tendency to form clots under a number of conditions. And one of those conditions happened inside the Jarvik heart. So the trick was to come up with something that was at least as good as the Jarvik, but didn't create clots. In addition, it was desirable to have the patient not tethered to anything, but able to walk around and have a more or less normal life. So one of the things that Abiomed brought to that problem was they had a very blood compatible polyether urethane plastic material, which had a very long flex life. The flex life was key because pieces of plastic in the heart were going to bend every time the heart beat. And so they needed something that could flex for billions of times without cracking. And this plastic had that capability. It was also blood could be in contact with this plastic without forming clots. So that was an important component. They had already made tri-leaflet heart valves out of this plastic. They were trying to get into the valve replacement business at the time. And it had been heavily tested in animals and short-term in humans. So you had a valve tri-leaflet valve literally means it has three leaflets. It looks like a little flower and opens and closes as the fluid flows in one direction or the other. They also had technology for casting blood pumps and valves from that plastic, which had been heavily tested. They had experience manufacturing and clinically managing air-driven devices for temporary heart assistance. They also had a multi-regional supporting medical team. They were connected to hospitals all over the country. I'll mention later a few of the doctors that were involved in this, and they really wanted to do it. So that was what they brought to the table. So as an engineer, you take a look at a new problem, and these are the steps that you go through. You first have to define the requirements. You then have to take those requirements and convert them into a form that's actually useful for you in designing the thing, which isn't necessarily obvious. Take a look at a couple of different design approaches and develop the details enough to be able to choose one of those approaches. And then test each of the parameters of that design to see that it meets the requirements, and then improve it in successive steps. So this was the approach that I used with the heart. At the time I started with Abiomed, they had a very crude, I would hesitate to call it a prototype, but it was a device that at least pumped fluid and beat. But it was something like 8 inches long, and it had this cylinder in the middle that slammed back and forth between the ends. Not the sort of thing you would want to put in anybody's chest. So the first thing I had to do on the job was to take a look at what would be the size and shape of an artificial heart. And, there were requirements that I realized were going to be quite important that nobody had ever written down, like it can't be too loud audibly, and it can't induce shocks in the surrounding tissue. And so I came up with the idea of having a device where the parts rotated inside rather than banging back and forth. And taking a look at the chest, have an idea of what its size and shape had to be. Now, the National Institute of Health was paying the bills, and they basically said, okay, the first version of this is going to be targeted for adult US males. Lots of reasons for that. At the time, they thought that men had more heart attacks than women. Anyway, that was what we were told to do. There was a significant difference between the average man and the average woman in terms of the amount of blood flow required and the size of the chest. So we were going to do this one to fit into a male and provide enough flow for an exercising male. And that flow turns out to be 4 to 8 liters per minute, depending on how heavily the person is exercising. Pressures, just from measurements that had been made on people, nominally the blood pressure was going to be 105 millimeters. And the pulmonary pressure, the pressure in the lungs, was going to be 25 millimeters. And it had maxima associated with that of 150 millimeters for the flow to the body and 80 millimeters for pulmonary pressure. So this would handle a reasonable amount of high blood pressure. And then the pulse rate, we decided was going to be 60 to 120 beats per minute. There was a big question at the time, does the artificial heart have to beat? can you just flow the blood continually through the body? And nobody really knew. You know, how could you tell? But uh, the thought among the doctors was that a pulsatile pressure probably helps with organ perfusion, especially if the organ is not healthy in an elderly person, for example. So it was decided that it would have to have a pulse. Okay, so we went on from there, and this was the system concept. Uh, the pink is the basic device. It's got blood pumps that pump the blood around. It's got what was called an energy converter, which is basically the gadget that's pumping the blood around, creating the pumping power, and the electronics which controlled it, which would also go into that pink section. And then that would be connected to a battery that was in the abdominal area that was going to power the thing. And then there would be the round device in the lower right, which is a transcutaneous skin transformer. This was a way of getting power into the body without having to puncture the skin. You would essentially have a coil under the skin and a coil that went on the outside of the skin that were magnetically coupled, and you would use a high frequency magnetic field to transfer energy through there. And then there would be a replaceable battery pack that you wore in a vest, which is shown around the waist here, which would be capable of running the battery for something like the whole system for something like 8 hours. I have to say, I had come out of the solar business before this. And so my friends were all adding a little beanie on the top of the head with a solar cell on it to run the system off of solar energy. But I have to say, we never powered it with solar energy. Okay, so how big could it be? Was around 1990. CAT scans were the best images available of the heart and the chest. And so a lot of measurements were made on people, men specifically, with CAT scanner. And these were the dimensions that we took off of those measurements. So, you know, you can see all the important measurements in terms of various directions in the chest. This was 1990, you really didn't have very good three-dimensional CAD capabilities. So especially for handling irregular shapes like this, it was very primitive. And so literally measuring dimensions on a CAT scan with a ruler was the way you got the shape that you wanted to have. So here's a system diagram. This is what we decided to do. We wanted to make what we called an electrohydraulic unit. In other words, the hydraulic part is pushing fluids around, which we obviously have to do to pump the blood, but we wanted it to have electrical energy going in. This is opposed to the pressurized gas that had been used for bedside units. And that way we could use the skin transformer and those sorts of things in order to make the patient capable of moving around without being tethered. So if you look at this diagram, at the top, you have two ventricles. The right ventricle pumps blood to the lungs, and the left ventricle pumps blood through the aorta to the body. So looking at the top, the right side pump is the right ventricle of the heart, and the left side pump is the left ventricle. But unlike the natural heart, where both of them pump out, which is called systole, at the same time, on our heart, we would have alternating pulses out of first the right side, then the left side. That way we could use our hydraulic pump to pump one pump to with a couple of fluid valves to be able to operate both sides of the heart. The flow out of the right and left sides of the heart is almost the same, but it turns out that almost is a very important matter. Because there's a certain amount of blood that goes out of the left ventricle of the heart into the aorta and immediately is used to provide nutrition and oxygen to the heart muscle itself. And it then returns to the left side. So there's this little circulation that goes on in the body that messes up the symmetry of the two sides. And you need to be able to deal with that. Otherwise, you build up too high a pressure in the lungs. And so this left-right flow imbalance chamber was our answer to that. It was another little hydraulic fluid mechanism. And the left atrium is where the blood is coming in from the lungs. So you could use the lung pressure to regulate that and it would be self-regulating. And that was the way we took care of that problem. We had the fluid switch and hydraulic pump that pumped hydraulic fluid. In our case, we were using silicone oil as a hydraulic fluid to pump alternately to the right and left sides. So we would essentially inflate that shaded part of the pump with hydraulic fluid, and that would push the blood out. The valves that you see indicated there meant that the blood would go only in the correct direction. Going back to the left side of this diagram, we see a vertical line representing the skin. And so we had electronics and an oscillator on the outside of the skin that was creating this high frequency magnetic field. And we used the same path for power and for signal so that we were able to communicate with the computer inside the body. We literally could plug this whole thing into a standard computer port and communicate with the device. And this could be used for diagnostics, for uploading updates to the program, and so on. Inside the skin, you have the power conditioning, which took this high frequency signal and used it to charge the internal battery and then communicate with the controller. And the controller had to run the motor of the fluid pump and also run the fluid switch to make the heart beat. And it had to have a couple of sensors, which I'll talk about later. So that was the system. And now that I've got this, there we go. Let's see. Okay, so this is how the whole thing works. You have two conditions. You're basically either pumping blood out to the lungs or you're pumping blood out to the body through the aorta. When pumping to the lungs, this is what's shown in the top diagram. You have the hydraulic pump pumping fluid to the right side, which pushes the blood out of the right pump and into the lungs. And you have the flow compensation mechanism, which is essentially operated by the blood pressure coming out of the lungs and into the left heart. And that would adjust the amount of fluid that was available for this operation. When you were pumping out of the left side, shown at the bottom, the direction of the hydraulic pump is reversed, and it's then pumping fluid into the left side. the left ventricle, which forces the blood out of the ventricle and into the aorta. So you see that we have basically four connections in to the blood flow of the body. The venous return, which is the veins that come back to the right atrium of the heart. The uh a the pulmonary artery, which comes out of the right pump and goes to the lungs. The pulmonary vein, which takes blood back from the lungs into the left atrium, and the aorta connection. So four relatively large blood vessels that you need to connect to. The nice thing about choosing the heart as an artificial organ is that it's really just a pump. If you can pump the blood around, the heart doesn't really need to do anything else. There was a tricky part as far as figuring out when do you need to pump harder when somebody is exercising? And taking a lot of measurements on a lot of animals and people, we found that what the heart really did was it regulated the venous return pressure. If the body is exercising, the blood vessels distend in, and you get a higher venous return pressure, and that is the signal for the heart to pump more. So we needed a sensor that would sense that, and we put that sensor in the right pump. And then obviously we needed to know when you had completely pumped out one of the ventricles. So we needed a sensor to tell us at the end of a heartbeat to reverse a direction. And those were the two sensors. Interesting. Sometimes the slide advance is working and sometimes it isn't. And right now it isn't.
Page up, page down.
Okay, I guess that worked. This is just a comment about that imbalance flow that I was talking about earlier. Okay, so, that's all very nice, but now we actually have to design a hydraulic pump. And they use somewhat different parameters than the doctors use. So this is the diagram for pump design. The vertical scale is the pressure against which the pump is working, the differential pressure. And the horizontal scale is the amount of flow. And you see sort of the U-shaped curves. Those represent constant efficiency of the pump. And the sort of dotted curves that go from upper left to lower right represent what the body is doing at various levels of exercise. So there's a diagram, I don't know if you can make it out here. It's sort of a parallelogram in the lower right part of this, which represents where we expect the pump to be working most of the time. The top part of it being during systemic flow and the bottom part during pulmonary flow. So this was something that I could give to a pump designer, and he would then be able to actually make a pump that would do this. It was kind of an interesting process. We went to a company that specialized in this sort of thing, and they said that for hundreds of thousands of dollars, they would be willing to design us, no guarantees, but they would be able to design us a pump that would do what we wanted with this. I found an old professor at MIT, kind of a character. He never drove a car. he rode a reclining bicycle around town. And he was a pump designer. And so I, went into his office and met with him one day and showed him this diagram. And he said, yeah. And he pulled out a pencil and paper and he sketched a pump for me on his desk. And he said, it'll look pretty much like this. I'd need a couple of hours to optimize it, but I can let you have this next week. So he was the one who designed our pump. We decided the pump would be a centrifugal pump and it would be pumping silicone oil as our hydraulic fluid, and it would run at about 5 to 7,000 RPM, pretty fast. And this is what the pump looks like. The top diagram is the outside of the pump, which is called the volute. And you can see it's kind of got a spiral shape, and the impeller, which is the lower picture, spins inside that. And it's driven by a brushless DC motor. And so the fluid gets essentially spit out of that port at the top right of the volute. So that's the pump. Then we had to reverse the direction of pumping so that the heart could beat. And so we put that whole thing inside a rotary valve. And this is a picture of the valve. It has a couple of parts. And essentially what it does is take that fluid flow and direct it to one of two different paths so that we could reverse the direction of the pumping. This was a tricky piece to make because it had to be very precise and very stable. We made it all out of titanium. So this is what the whole thing looked like. We had a couple of different designs for the blood pump. I'll talk about those a little later. But it was essentially a plastic bag on each side that made of this very blood compatible plastic had a very long flex life, and it had valves at the inlet and outlet of each bag, the bag being the ventricles. The electronics just fit into whatever space was available on this thing. And the trick then was to make sure that it would fit. And well, one of the things that made this tricky is it not only had to fit into a human chest, it had to fit into an animal's chest so that we could test it. And so the one you're looking at here was used in a cow. And this is what it looked like after it had been removed from the cow. As far as the other parts of the system, we had a infrared optical sensor to detect when the bag was completely inflated or deflated. So we just painted with white paint, we painted a spot on the bag and then used a reflective sensor to look for when that reached the end of its travel. We instrumented the left side just because you didn't need two of them, and came up with an algorithm to calibrate it. And then so that was the stroke sensor. For the pressure sensor, we used an industrial pressure sensor that sat in the hydraulic fluid, the silicone fluid at the right intake. And this measured the venous pressure. in the body, and so we could use that to tell the microprocessor when it needed to speed up or slow down to match the level of exercise that the individual was doing. And just in case one of these sensors failed, we had a backup mode where you essentially ignored all the signals and just ran at constant speed, which would not be particularly nice for the person, but at least they'd be alive. And that made a very simple electronic interface. Other components, we needed to get energy through the skin. That had been developed by another company and was being used in a different kind of device. And so we used their device. It's an air core transformer, one side in under the skin and one side outside the skin. And we had a power pack that was implanted in the abdomen for about 1 hour. The idea of this power pack was just to let somebody take everything off and take a shower and not have to worry about it. And then they would wear an 8-hour battery pack as a vest. They'd have a spare that was being charged up so that after 8 hours, they would switch vests and take the fresh one and charge up the other one. And this gave the person complete mobility, subject to wearing a vest, they could go anywhere, do anything they wanted, which was really a dramatic change in the experience of the patients. We had to figure out what kind of battery we were going to use. We had limited volume and didn't want to have too much weight for the battery. And so I took a look at all the different batteries that were available at that time. This was when lithium ions really were just coming on the market and barely available. So it turned out that the amount of energy per unit volume was an important parameter, and the cycle life was an important parameter, because you could always get more cycle life by making the battery bigger. If you double the size, if you have two batteries, you can get twice the life of one battery. So, so the energy per unit volume times the cycle life was the parameter that we wanted to maximize. And so for various types of batteries, you can see how they compared, and lithium ion was the outstanding choice. And so we decided to go with lithium ion batteries for this, which back in 1990 was kind of a surprising choice. Today, I think most people would recognize that was a good choice to have made. So, okay, so here's the control algorithm. You have the atrial pressures, and since the pressure sensor was being sensed at the intake of the pump, you got it for free. You kind of got two pressures, but you only needed one of them, the right atrial pressure, to actually run the system. And then you had the stroke sensor for telling you optically when the ventricles had reached the end of their stroke. So the stroke sensor provided the beat rate of the pump, and the atrial pressure provided the signal for how fast the pump should run. So it was a very simple control system. As you exercised, the capillaries would expand and the right atrial pressure would go up, and that would tell the pressure sensor to tell the computer to speed up. And the stroke sensor was used in order to switch the pump back and forth to make it beat. We weren't entirely sure that that this algorithm would make a person or an animal happy, so we actually had to try it out to see that that worked. There were lots of things to learn from the first experiments. Oh, and the whole thing had to be connected to the body. Uh, at the input from the veins, you have a relatively soft, large structure that you wanted to connect to. And for heart transplants, they use a cloth cone that they use to sew the heart the new heart to the body. So we decided to use a similar cone. And then the outlet of the heart has to connect to the pulmonary artery and the aorta. And surgeons typically used a cloth cannula to make that connection. And they knew how to work with that. And so we made our outlet that same material. There was a problem though, and this problem was very well known, that the body tends to grow new material, and it tends to grow the material in the bloodstream down fluid flow lines. So if you didn't do anything about it, you would get this material growing from the body down into the artificial heart, and it would block the flow, and the person would die. So we needed to have a way to connect that part of the heart to the body while not allowing the body to grow into it. And I actually have a patent on this solution. Um, we made the shape of the connection such that in order to grow all the way through it, the body would have to grow upstream, which it doesn't do. And so by taking advantage of the fluid flow at the inlet, I was able to solve that problem. Now, being an engineer, everything has equations, and these are all the equations describing the artificial heart. Uh, you have conservation of energy, you have the fluid equations, um, you have the basic parameters of what the body is doing, and you had the energy balance. The Abiy core, one of the biggest disadvantage of the Abiy core is that it draws quite a bit of power, 14 to 19 watts, whereas you have less than half a watt of actual fluid power going into the blood. So it's not terribly efficient. Other approaches are more efficient than that, but this was the approach that we decided to take. And since you only had about a 10-pound battery in the vest, that seemed to be an acceptable compromise. Okay, so this is what the device all put together looked like. We had a choice of the shape of the blood pumps, these plastic bags that are going to hold the blood. One shape was called ellipsoidal, and it's basically the shape of a bag, and you see it here. And the other is toroidal, like a donut. The toroidal shape was one that I had come up with, and it has a lot of advantages in the blood flow inside the toroid. For example, when the valves are closed, the blood can continue to circulate around the donut, and the blood likes that. However, the ellipsoidal were more easy to manufacture and manufacture reliably. And so we decided ultimately to go with the ellipsoidal blood pumps, the ones shown in the photograph at the top. The energy converter was essentially inside the middle of the whole thing. This was the pump and valves. And the electronics hybrid was then attached in the space available. I actually designed the hybrid myself. The shape of the whole thing was critical. It has to fit in the chest. It has to have inlets and outlets that are in the right places to connect to the body. And I made a gazillion different models out of different materials. The one you're looking at here is wood. A lot of them were made of clay. Some of them were made of wax. And so we tried just to be able to make a model of the shape of the thing and then actually see if it would fit. The atrial cuffs and the arterial connections are a flexible cloth, and they can be cut with the scissors by the surgeon to adjust it at the last minute, but the basic hard parts needed to be the right shape. So we did some fit testing. This top picture is a picture of one of my clay models placed in the chest of a calf and showing that I was able to make the inlets and outlets all line up very nicely with the arteries and veins of the calf. The lower picture is a cadaver study. You're looking at a dead man's chest, and you can see that my model sitting in the chest in the place where the heart would have been. And again, we could make it line up rather well. It was kind of a tight fit, but it worked. So that showed that we could do it. So we then did a lot of experiments, most of them using calves. It turns out that a calf at about a year old has about the blood flow of a human being, and so it's a good model. It works really well because the shape and size of the calf's chest is similar enough to that of a human that we could use the same device. The problem is that the calf grows, and if you try to do a long-term experiment with the calf, eventually the calf grows too big for the heart and doesn't have enough blood flow. Goats don't grow that large, and so they could be used as test animals. The problem is that the goat's chest is rather narrow. It's a little different shape than the human, and so it was hard to fit the device into the goat. Pigs have chests that are similar to human, but they're really difficult to manage compared to goats and cows. And so for the most part, we used cows. And I got to know a lot of cows up close and personal. One of the things we wanted to look at from these animal experiments is, are we creating blood clots the way the Jarvik did? So what you're looking at here is one of the devices after a calf experiment, where you're looking into the atrium through, this is essentially looking at the heart from the animal side. And the blood would flow into this cuff. And this had my patented connection in there to try to keep any material from growing into it. And as you can see, it's perfect. The cloth is coated with blood, of course, but there are no ugly blood clots in there. So this was very good news. It said that our patients could use this device and not have strokes. So this is from a paper by, you can see the authors at the top here. I'll mention a couple of the names. Gus Vlahakis was the chief cardiac surgeon at Mass General Hospital. And O.H. Frazier, Bud Frazier, was the head cardiac surgeon at the Texas Heart Institute. And I spent a lot of time working with both of them. And then these are other doctors from other hospitals around the country, very well-known doctors that also used experimental versions of this and reported on their patients. The results, in the first experiment with a device like this, the FDA requires that you choose patients who are essentially dying anyway. And the idea is to make sure you do no harm. And so we had 14 near-death patients that were supported by this device. These were very sick people, so they weren't expected to live. They just wanted to make sure that the heart didn't do anything to hurt them. And they actually did much better than expected. One of them actually lived for about half a year. This patient basically said what he wanted from the artificial heart was he wanted to be able to go fishing again. And he was discharged from the hospital with wearing the vest, and he went fishing. It was a big success. Over time, Abiomed bought the rights to other devices that had been developed so that they could make a smaller, more energy efficient heart. But they continued to do experiments and apply to the FDA for use with this device. In 2005, there was an FDA meeting where they very nearly approved it, but not quite. So this is what the device looks like. And there's our diagram. And then in 2006, the FDA approved it for 2,000 patients. We were also developing a smaller device for women. And again, there was a lot of animal testing. And this is a picture of the AbioCore 2, the device that was actually taken for human use. So at that point, you have a technology that works. And so this was at the point where I pretty much I left the company and took another job. There was a lot going on in the cardiac area at that point, and one of them was the development of axial flow pumps. I had actually designed one of these, but these are quite small, and you can put it right in the aorta instead of having to remove the heart. It can be used for supporting blood flow for just the left ventricle or for the right side or both. And so these are of great interest today. So this is called an axial flow ventricle assist device, VAD. It's only about an inch long, it's quite small. There are two kinds of ventricle assist devices that are in use today. The circumferential, this is basically, the kind of pump you usually see. It's very similar actually to the fluid pump that I showed you pictures of earlier. And it's called the HeartMate. And it's been used in 27,000 patients around the world. And then the axial flow, similar to the picture I just showed you, which is the HeartMate 3. And it's newer, and people are quite excited about it. One of the things that has happened is Johnson & Johnson bought Abiomed, and they're very interested in the largest possible market. And it turns out that a lot of the patients can benefit from a one-side support, an LVAD, rather than a total heart. And so this is the direction that most of the sales have gone. So the conclusion of this was that the total heart works for somebody that has total biventricular failure. And another type of device has been developed, which is for short-term support for the circulation. Abiomed calls this the Impella. It's a very small device that's actually slipped in through the arteries up to the aorta and operated there. And 300,000 patients have been supported by that heart pump. There's also been some problems. Inserting this thing up through the aorta, there's been some problem with perforation of the aorta, which is a really bad problem. And so there's been some recalls of that device. So the work is continuing. But basically, that's where we are today. So now I'll take questions.
Larry Fryer, Alan. I have two questions. By the way, my video isn't working. One is the amount of power that you use. Does that present any thermal issues inside the body?
It's a good question. No, it's not. The area of the device is large enough that that amount of heat being leaked into the chest doesn't cause any problems with the tissue. That was something that we were concerned about, but it turned out to be okay.
Okay, the other one is based on the size of the individual, does the size of the artificial heart have to vary?
Uh, a couple of models would cover the entire range. Basically, you had one model for men, medium to large men, and one model for women, uh, medium to small women, and very small men.
Okay, the other thing, it appears that this is just a very short-term solution for X number of months. What's the prognosis for the future?
Okay, well, this was intended to be a permanent implant. The design life was 5 years, and we actually designed it for 10 years so that we would be sure we would get 5. And we did in vitro experiments where we actually had the thing beating in a tank of salt water for 10 years. And it's just fine. The life limiting thing is generally the flexing of the plastic. And if the plastic cracks, which is also a problem with heart valves, but if it develops a crack, you have a problem. And the only thing you could do then would be to reoperate and replace the device. But in medical terms, if somebody has a terminal condition, if they're dying and you can keep them alive for 5 years, that's considered a success. So 5 years is the usual criterion for a medical device or a medical treatment in terms of being essentially forever.
Where do we stand now on that 5 years? Have there been any patients that have lasted 5 years?
Oh, yes.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yes. Not with the total heart because they pretty much slowed down that, but the individual ventricular assist devices, you've got hundreds of thousands of patients, and those last well beyond 5 years.
Is that very dependent on the age of the patient? In other words, I'm assuming that other body functions are better for somebody who's young.
Well, obviously, if somebody is old enough, they're going to die anyway before the heart gives out. There's actually an interesting ethical problem that we ran into here. Typically, with the natural heart, if a person gets old and sick, the kidneys start to go, the liver starts to go, poisons build up in the blood, the heart starts to go, and the whole thing spirals down, and the person dies in a reasonably short time, which is a good thing. If you break that cycle, if you put in an artificial heart, that thing is going to be pumping no matter what the rest of the body is doing. So you can keep somebody alive but miserable for a very long time. And so there's the ethical question of when do you turn it off? And that was the subject of a lot of discussion.
Is that up to the patient?
Uh, Generally, yes, but sometimes if the patient is sick enough, they may not be able to make that decision. That's where you get into the usual directives for, who's going to make decisions for the patient when they're in this condition.
I also have a
I
question.
imagine that ultimately the patient could decide to just not recharge the battery.
Oh, you
And
can turn it off. That's not a problem. The question is, when do you want to do that? It's sort of like removing a ventilator.
I'm talking about the patient and him or herself could do that.
Yes, that's true.
So does this unit
John,
still,
did you have a different question?
yes, does this unit still require the magnetic field between the inside and outside of the body? And if so, mightn't there be a variety of things that could cause problems with that?
Um,
Like getting on an airplane?
well, it does. I don't know what they're doing about that in terms of the getting on an airplane. I mean, getting on an airplane with a big piece of titanium in you can also be a problem. You don't want to go into an MRI machine with something that's got a magnetic field of its own. So there are a number of situations where that would be limiting, but they don't really keep you from using the device.
I would suggest that the issue, John, the issue is not unique to this device. There are probably other medical devices that are implanted that can cause serious issues, and somehow, people seem to get around that. But that's just my conjecture.
My wife had a device that in theory helped bone to grow and put out a magnetic field. And the issue was whether or not the magnetic field would screw up her insulin pump. So there are some tricky things that can happen.
Mhm.
Ted?
Ted, you have your hand up?
Yeah, thanks. So you quoted a power input. Now, the power input was, I didn't catch where that power input was. In terms of at what phase of the process of getting power to the pump was that power input quoted?
This was at the input to the skin transformer.
Oh, okay, so that's on the outside of the body then.
Right. So
Okay, and it was
you're putting
15
about
or
a
so
half a
watts.
watt- You're putting about a half a watt into the blood, and you're putting maybe up to 15 watts into the body.
So
And the rest of it becomes heat.
right. So the question is, if you were putting the power directly into an electromagnetic pump, then you're talking maybe 2 watts or something actually involved in pumping.
Yeah, the mechanical versions of this without the hydraulic parts, I think operate at something in the order of 5 watts.
5 watts. So you could potentially use a radioactive isotope thermal power source and implant it and get rid of all the external connections to the world.
Yeah, there was actually one of the other companies that was funded to do this started off with that approach.
Mm.
And the problems of radiation exposure at that level of power and shielding and such were such that it became non-feasible.
Okay, because depending on the particular radioisotope involved, the decay process may or may not produce any significant external radiation
It
from
wasn't the external radiation, it was radiation to the tissues around it in the body.
Yeah, no, I'm saying external radiation to
Oh,
the source. The
yeah.
source itself, if there's some decay processes that just produce a charged particle decay, and it's confined to the device itself. There's nothing that gets outside.
Yeah,
No.
I can only tell you that they tried it and it didn't work.
Harry?
Well, they may
Yeah.
have used the wrong radioisotope. But,
Hi,
thank you.
Alan, I'm blown away by your descriptions of what you actually did. We're all, or at least a lot of us are used to working with computer systems and the internet, and they have the one great advantage that no one dies while you're inventing it. And I'm sort of curious about a couple of things. First of all, how much was the project, the value that you got from the government for doing the initial project that you talked about at Abacor?
Yeah, it was running at about $1 million a year.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I don't know, as you got into human trials, things got expensive. We actually had to scramble a jet when a patient became available anywhere in the country so that we could get our team there. I left the company at that point. I didn't particularly want to do that stuff. But it certainly found myself doing a lot of things that I would not have expected an electrical engineer to do.
Yeah. I was going to ask you then, what was it like in terms of your emotions, in terms of the urgency of coming up with a solution? Was that an effect that you felt?
It had been a lot of years that they didn't have this device, and so I felt like if it took a couple of years to get this done, that was going to be okay. There's the emotional, there's always the question of how are you going to feel when you're standing in the operating room next to a real patient who's got this kind of stuff being installed, or even if it's an animal, what you've got this animal on the table in front of you. And what I found was that it was so fascinating to be involved with, you're monitoring all these things about the patient, human or animal, blood gases and pulse rate and temperature and all these parameters. It's like flying a plane. And you're paying so much attention to all these measurements that you're making and trying to make decisions about what to do next, that I kind of didn't have time to be upset about it.
Can I just ask you about xenotransplants? These are transplants from animals, and they've been done for heart cases, but for some reason they don't work. Why don't they work? Is it an autoimmune problem or? No?
Yeah, my understanding is there are so many things in our body that react badly to our immune system reacting badly to a foreign substance.
Mhm.
And there's just been lots and lots and lots of foreign substance rejection problems.
Mhm. Yeah.
I think we read about one a little while ago. They had developed animal that had very close to human proteins on the surface,
Mhm.
and it turned out that that particular animal had had some kind of a viral infection that caused the patient to die.
Yeah.
It's probably going to happen.
Mhm.
It's not easy.
Mm.
One of the things that was kind of interesting, I didn't mention in this talk, There was the question of the social cost of providing these devices.
Mhm.
And I gave some testimony to the Institute of Medicine. It turns out that for a heart transplant, the patient has to be on immunosuppressant drugs for the rest of their life.
Yeah.
These are very expensive drugs,
Mhm.
to the point where a lot of the patients were what they called insurance disabled. They
Hmm.
couldn't go out and get a job, not because of their health, but because they would lose their insurance coverage and they couldn't afford to pay for the drugs.
Mm.
With the artificial heart, there is no living material there. It's all inert plastics and titanium and stuff like that. And you don't need immunosuppression. So actually, over the total life of the patient, the artificial heart might actually be cheaper than a transplant.
Yeah, I think those drugs are at least $100,000 a year to avoid rejection.
A question here, Alan, along the same line, I was surprised that there was no immune system response to it, but I figured out because of the materials that you're using, you're not going to get that. But I'm wondering along the same lines, how these humans react. In other words, how did they feel with it? Was there any thought about it's not working for me, I'm not going to use it? Sort of the emotional and the physical responses that your patients had.
Generally, they were pretty happy with it, especially being able to get out of bed, leave the hospital. That was very important to them. Now, I had left the team by the time a lot of these patients were done. So I might not have heard all of that. But I did meet a number of patients, not necessarily for our device, but who were using similar devices. And they were in good shape. By the time somebody needs one of these devices, they're very sick and pretty miserable. And often they would get one of these devices as a temporary bridge to transplant. And with one of these devices in, they could go to the gym, they could exercise, they could go for walks. And they got to feeling pretty good so that they were ready to have a transplant operation. So I would say most of the patients were pretty happy with it. For various companies' devices, one of the things that was very important to the patients was that the device shouldn't make noise. It's one thing to hear your heartbeat, but to hear an artificial heart and wonder when it's going to stop was quite upsetting. So the device had to be quiet. It had to be unobtrusive.
How much does the device and the medical insertion cost?
Remember, I was working on this in 1990, so my numbers would be really, really old.
I'll double it.
Well, okay. I mean, a heart transplant at that time was tens of thousands of dollars, the operation with the team and all that stuff. Our device would be roughly double that.
Okay, it's really not too bad.
But I don't know what the real numbers are today.
Alan, what was the response of patients, when they had this heart? Did they say that they felt different other than physiological changes? Did they feel different in any way having this implanted and the device in their chest? Did it feel unusual? They feel top heavy or anything silly like that?
No, nothing silly like that. As I say, I left before a lot of the patient feedback would have been available. But I mean, similar devices that are being used in large numbers today, I've met patients that are on them. And they don't complain about it. I probably individuals would have, their own responses. I would say if you ask the same question of people who got a heart transplant, you would probably get a wide variety of answers as to how people feel about walking around with somebody else's heart in their chest. So it's probably similar to that.
Thanks, interesting. Anybody else? Any questions?
I just looked it up, and the cost of heart transplants in 2024 is $1.3 million per procedure.
Wow,
There you go.
it has gone up, hasn't it? I know that a heart transplant in France was about half the cost of a heart transplant in the United States back then. I suspect that's still true.
National health insurance, yeah.
Well,
This
there's the
doesn't
cost
seem
of the
to be-
patient, and there's a cost to the patient, and there's the actual, cost, if you will, the true. It's like manufacturing anything. There's the selling price and the manufacturing cost of a given product, and the difference is called profit.
And that a lot of the doctors were passing around at the time was that they could take one of these heart assist devices and put it in the patient, but they had to be really careful when they told the patient how much it cost.
They have a heart attack.
I thought this was a really good talk.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Heartwarming.